r/Nosleep. Posted by u/Born Beach. Somebody tried to kill me when I was young. A monster saved my life. Part 1. I developed a drug addiction in my teens. It tore me apart for a long time, but it was nothing compared to the events that sparked it. I know. We've all struggled. Get over it. That's what my dad would say, the son of a bitch. My mom would probably feign empathy, but fuck it up by trying a little too hard. Then she'd drink herself to sleep. This isn't a story about my dad and my mom though. This isn't even a story about my addiction. This is a story about a monster, and the scars they left upon my life. It's a story about the end of my world, and it might be a story about the end of yours too. It began when I was 8. Third grade, for me, was not a pleasant time. Sure, there are bright spots in the year. There always are. Overall though, I rate third grade a 1/10, and that's probably being generous. You may have surmised that my mother and father were not exactly great role models in my life. My dad was cold and, in retrospect, probably a sociopath, or at least a narcissist. He rarely spent time with me, and when he did I could tell he regretted it. Usually he did his best to forget I existed. My mother was kinder. Sometimes she'd help me with my homework, and she'd always drive me to school. When she dropped me off, she'd wave goodbye with a smile and, as if reading from a script, tell me she loved me and hoped I had a good day. I liked my mom. Sometimes, I think I even loved her. At least, when she wasn't drinking. Her vice made sense in retrospect, given the man she decided to shore up with, but what didn't make sense, especially to 8-year-old me, were the relentless insults she'd throw my way. Lazy. Waste of space. Brat. Dumbass. These were all mainstays of her vocabulary, and never far from her lips once they'd been soaked with wine. My only reprieve from the depression of my home life was school. Growing up, I loved everything about it. I loved hanging out with my friends, I loved learning new subjects, and I especially loved the teachers who always had time for me, and never drank and always remembered my name. One of those teachers was Mr. Gillard. A boisterous, heavy-set man with bushy eyebrows and an uncanny ability to always brighten the room. He wasn't my teacher, but he was my best friend Oscar's, and because of that I often crossed paths with him. He remembered my name the first time I ever told it to him. Every day after that, he'd greet me with his beaming smile and booming voice. "Walter. How was class today?" I would always tell him exactly how it was. Usually it was good, but sometimes it was frustrating, or boring. No matter what though, Mr. Gillard would always listen intently, his eyes focused on me and a grin on his face. He was the first man I met that inspired me to be better. He was the first man I met that made me believe I could be. One day, I was feeling particularly low. In the middle of the previous night, my mother had woken me up. I smelled wine on her breath, and I asked her if she had been drinking again. She told me to shut up, that it was none of my business. Swaying on her feet, she stood over my bed, staring at me. I remember feeling really nervous, because there was this sense of hatred in her eyes, and the way she studied me almost seemed like she was making a decision. "Mom?" I remember asking. "Can I go back to sleep now?" She didn't reply. Instead, she left the room. I curled back into my covers, nervous and afraid, although what I was nervous and afraid about I couldn't exactly say. It felt like an intuition. Something deep inside of me, something primal, was screaming that the way my mother was looking at me was not okay. A few moments later, I heard the creak of my door opening, and then there she was again, this time with a half-drunk glass of wine in her grip. "I wish I never met your father," my mother said, staring at me with dead eyes. "That way you'd never have been born, and I'd have enough money to enjoy my life." She watched me until she finished her glass of wine, and then she left. I cried myself to sleep. The next day I spent recess alone, at the far end of the field. I didn't feel like I deserved friends. I didn't feel like I deserved to have fun. I didn't feel like I deserved anything. When the bell rang, I took my time getting back to class. As I entered the doors of the school, I was greeted by an empty hallway. The rest of the students had already returned to class. I swallowed, knowing I was in for a talking to, and probably a detention once I got back. A voice called out, and I recognized it as Mr. Gillard. "Walter!" he shouted. Out of all the teachers I could have crossed paths with, somehow Mr. Gillard felt like the worst. He was the one adult I really believed cared about me, and liked me for I was. For him to see me late like this, it probably destroyed whatever respect he had for me. "Sorry, Mr. Gillard," I said, my eyes downcast. He wasn't angry. Instead, he knelt down in front of me. "Is something wrong?" I shook my head, but for one reason or another, the floodgates opened. My face scrunched up in a grimace, and then I started to sob. Before I knew it, I was bawling my eyes out in the empty hallway. He took me by the shoulder and ushered me into a classroom undergoing renovations. He closed the door and sat me down at the teacher's desk. "What's happened?" he asked me, his voice calm and kind. I told him everything. I told him about my father's cold indifference, my mom's drinking, and how last night she had woken me up to tell me she wished I'd never been born. I worked all of it out between sobs, my nose runny with snot and my cheeks soaking wet with tears. Mr. Gillard pulled me into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry, Walter," he said. At length, he let me go, and then sighed. "You know, it's tough to talk about these things at times, but it's important that we do. My parents weren't especially kind to me either, you know." It seemed strange to me that somebody like Mr. Gillard, the kindest man I knew, could have had parents who were anything less than saints. I didn't know what to say, but thankfully I didn't need to say anything, because he kept talking. Something important, that I think a lot of people learn far too late in life, is that none of us are defined by our parents or our upbringings. Our future is our own. We get to choose who we become. "We do?" I asked him, calming down. I sniffled and wiped my nose on my sleeve. "That's right, we do," he said, his voice adopting a more serious tone. His eyes, usually so bright and full of cheer, now looked sullen and filled with sadness. He seemed somehow distant. It took me a long time to realize that, Walter. For a long time I felt like I needed to do what society wanted, or be the sort of person my parents wanted me to be. It was only recently that I realized that in doing so, I wasn't actually living my life. Mr. Gillard sighed, shaking his head and muttering something beneath his breath. I never felt fulfilled, because each day I felt like I was a part of a play, or an act. I felt like I was fighting tooth and nail against my instincts, and it was only making me more desperate to see them through. He bit his lip. I was never happy. It was a heavy conversation to have with an 8-year-old, and while a lot of its nuance went over my head, I decided I got the gist of what he meant. So no matter what anybody says, even my mom and dad, I should just keep being me? He smiled, and the sadness in his expression seemed to evaporate near instantly. He was back to the beaming, joyous teacher I knew and loved. "Something like that," he said, ruffling my hair. "Hey, here's an idea. Why don't you join Oscar and the rest of my class tomorrow? We're going to be doing a trivia competition in the morning. Oscar tells me you're one of the smartest kids in the grade, and it'd be a shame if you missed out." I grinned, sniffling. I don't know if Mrs. Applefig would allow it. Actually. My eyes drifted up to the clock above the closed door. Its minute hand ticked forward to 10:32 a.m. I think I'm already gonna be in a lot of trouble for being so late. My mood plummeted all over again. Maybe my mother was right. I couldn't seem to do anything right, even get to class on time. "Well, then how about this?" Mr. Gillard said, standing up and opening up a drawer in the teacher's desk. He pulled out a stack of sticky notes and a pen. "I'll write you a note explaining your lateness, as well as giving you permission to attend tomorrow morning's trivia competition. Sounds good?" I nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, I'd love that." "Perfect," he said. "So would I?" He handed me 2 sticky notes. One excusing my late return following recess, and another requesting permission for me to attend trivia tomorrow morning. By some miracle, I spent the rest of the afternoon smiling. Oscar and I walked home together after school, and the entire time we brainstormed team names. We eventually decided on Brainiacs. "You better get us the win," Oscar teased. "Well duh," I laughed. "One of us has to." The two of us joked around and goofed off all the way home. For such a bad start to the day, I can scarcely remember a day ending with me feeling happier, and more full of life. When Oscar and I finally split off, we swore that tomorrow we'd go home as the trivia champions. As soon as I got home, I cheerily started on my homework. Mr. Gillard had given me a practice trivia question: what temperature does nitrate burn at? If I got it right, we earned an extra point immediately in the trivia competition. I thought long and hard about it, and decided I really had no idea. To be honest, I'd never heard the word nitrate before in my life. Which meant it was probably a trick question. It sounded like something way beyond a third grader, so maybe Mr. Gillard wasn't expecting me to know the answer. He had forbidden us from using the internet, and I bet you that if I got the right answer for it, then he'd know I was cheating. Instead, I wrote very hot with a confident flourish of my pencil. A short while later, I heard the front door open and my mom came home. She paid me a hasty smile, before pulling off her jacket and opening the cupboard to start on supper. "Hey Mom," I said, beaming. "How was work?" "Long, honey," she said, her eyes bloodshot and jaw set. "How was school?" "Great. I'm doing a trivia competition tomorrow with Mr. Gillard's class." She eyed me for a moment, and then smiled. "That's lovely. I'm sure you'll learn lots." "Me too." A half hour later my father came home. He threw his jacket over the kitchen chair and immediately asked where supper was. "I've been stressed all day, Sarah, and I come in you still haven't started dinner?" I shrank into my homework, doing my best to ignore my parents arguing. "I have started supper," my mother countered, "I just haven't started cooking it yet. The ingredients are all ready to go." "Jesus fuck, Sarah," my dad bellowed. "Can't anybody in this house do anything right?" That night I woke up to the smell of alcohol. I lay on my side, curled in blankets, and heard the sound of breathing near my face. "Worthless," my mother's voice whispered from behind me. I felt her hand wrap itself around my neck, and I didn't move, I didn't speak, I didn't so much as breathe. My body was paralyzed with fear. "You stole my life from me," she hissed. "If only you would just go away." Her fingers squeezed, their nails biting into my flesh. My throat contracted. I gasped for air, whimpering in pain and terror, and then almost as soon as she started, she stopped. Her hand slipped away from my neck. My back was to her, but I could tell from the shadow she cast on the wall that she was still there. Standing in the dark. Watching me. Drinking wine straight from the bottle. A half an hour later, she finished and put the bottle down on my dresser. I watched her silhouette wipe her lips, and heard her mutter the word, "Tonight." She left my room. I listened as her footsteps creaked their way down the stairs, and into the kitchen. A moment later came the sound of wood squealing against wood, like a drawer being opened, followed by the clatter of cutlery. I stared at my wall, blinking back tears. Again, that primal sense of fear returned. That indescribable intuition that something was very wrong, and I needed to be far away from my bedroom, and far away from this house. My heart thundered in my chest as I heard the creak of footsteps on the stairs. This time, coming up. The sounds grew louder, the higher and closer they got to my bedroom. Soon, the footsteps were in the hallway. I could hear my mom's voice muttering, although I couldn't make out any specific words. "Please," I thought to myself. "Please walk by my door. Please don't come inside." The footsteps groaned on the floorboards as they approached. My mother left my bedroom door ajar when she left, and from its crack I saw a shadow in the hallway. I heard her voice. "Threw away my career for this. Threw away my entire life, and also that you could take my money, take my time and destroy my marriage." The rusty hinges of my door whined, and the door swung open slowly. A shadow grew on my bedroom floor, and I recognized its shape as my mother in her nightgown. She held something in her right hand, but it wasn't a wine bottle. It was a knife. I curled into a ball, every part of me screaming to do something. To run. To call for help. To throw something at her. My instincts told me I was going to die. Instead, I lay there as still as a board, too paralyzed by fear to move or speak. Who would I call out to? My father. He didn't care about me. How was I supposed to run? My mother was blocking the doorway. What was I supposed to throw at her? The only thing I had nearby was my lamp, and I knew it wouldn't hurt her enough to stop her from hurting me. She walked toward my bed, standing beside it, knife in hand. I stared at her, hyperventilating with panic. She looked back into my eyes. She kept moving her lips, muttering words but not loud enough for me to hear. Her face was painted with revulsion and hatred, and every so often she would lift the knife up and threaten it, stabbing it down toward me. Then, she turned on her heel and left my room, closing the door behind her. I lay there, sat up in bed, my body too awash with adrenaline to even dream of sleeping or thinking or doing anything. I just waited, wired and awake. I waited for her to come back and kill me.